Okay, so here for this one, we have the Athletics, Jacob Whitehead, and also George Caulkin, who covers Newcastle as well. Right, George, I was having a little listen of the podcast, Pod on the Tyne, which you guys partly recorded as you were heading back from the defeat against Manchester City in the FA Cup. And there's one word that really stuck out for me. I think it was you that said it, faith. Is the faith still strong now from the Newcastle fan base?
Yeah, and I wrote about that. I wrote about that too because there was actually quite a familiar sight in terms of Newcastle's recent history at the end of the match, where you've got 7,800 Newcastle fans in the away end saluting their team after what was pretty much a routine 2-0 2-0 defeat against their against the champions. And you've got that sort of thought that I've had many times over the years, and people who watch Newcastle have had, it's like if only Newcastle had a team as good as their fans. But the reason I found that sort of quite interesting was that for most of the last 2 years, you've not had to have that thought because the team have played like the fans have sounded. They've played full of noise, full of aggression, front-footed. And yeah, for the first time for a long time, you're having to sort of take on faith that the club will improve, that the club will get better, will get stronger. One of the really powerful things over the since the takeover has been that thought that it doesn't really matter whether the team win or lose because it's going to get stronger and bigger and better 12 months down the line. The club will be better, the club will have improved. And actually, that's not happened in the last 12 months. So there are lots of reasons for that, and there's plenty of mitigation. But I just thought that was sort of quite an interesting moment that this club, which is, hasn't won a domestic trophy for 69 years, that's now destined to become 70, is sort of having to take things on faith again. The trajectory is still upwards, but it's not quite so easy to look into the near future, the short-term future, and say it's guaranteed that Newcastle are going to get better.
Yeah. Jacob, I wonder if this is some of the curse of being a football fan, wishing your team, praying that they do good, especially one with the press that surrounded Newcastle. But I guess have Newcastle been a victim of their own success, especially last season?
Yeah, to an extent. I actually chatted about this with George a couple of days ago, and we spoke about the idea of last season being Newcastle taking 3 steps forwards, and then this almost being a case of Newcastle taking one back. There's still been progress, but when you move at that speed, it creates a whole new host of problems. You suddenly have to bulk up your team in a way that you weren't anticipating to. You have to develop stylistically. Newcastle can't now just be good out of possession. They've got to have ways to kind of dominate games. Last season, Newcastle played, apart from their EFL Cup run, they just played a normal league schedule. This year, including pre-season and post-season tours, it's going to be 62 games. That's a massive number, especially for Newcastle, whose squad is simply not made for that. And with PSR laws as they are, where Newcastle can't afford to simply fill out the squad in a way that they'd ideally want to.
Mm. George, I'm just thinking about the fans and how I guess sometimes this season that faith has been tested. You look at losing away to Bournemouth. I think Newcastle had a lion's share of possession, more passes, yet less shots. Was that part of the frustration from the fans?
I think that Bournemouth game, I think that was back in November. That was what sort of one of the early
Mm.
moments when Newcastle's chronic injury list had really come to the fore. I don't think I mean it was a bad day. There was a sort of verbal altercation between Kieran Trippier and a fan at the end. I don't think that was a big thing. It wasn't fans turning en masse, quite the opposite, and they sort of sorted it out. But it was certainly a taste of what was to come. And when I talk about the mitigation, that's obviously a huge part of it. They've just had this astonishing injury list at a time when, as Jacob said, they've had far more games. They've been sort of doing 3 game weeks for the first time that most of them experienced, including as a coaching staff, and they just haven't had the numbers to be able to sort of cope with it. I think the sort of the other side of it is that again, 12 months ago, 13 months ago, coming away from Wembley, and in fact, then going to the Etihad in the first game after that, where they lost 2-0, I had this overwhelming sense like, okay, well, next time it'll be different. Next time, will give them more of a game. And Newcastle have given Man City more of a game. You know, they beat them in the League Cup near the start of the season. They did very well against them at St James's in the league until Man City brought on Kevin De Bruyne, and Newcastle had no sort of bench to call upon. But what I'm trying to say is, I think, is that, you know, it was the club sort of had that Midas touch, and there was a Midas feeling. There was this sort of huge magical feeling every time you went into a match, and this time it's been different. They've had two really tough transfer windows. One where you can argue that they didn't prioritise in the right areas of the team. They've had things like Sandro Tonali. Obviously, that was very difficult to predict. Other players, Harvey Barnes has barely been fit. Two young fullbacks who, for whatever reason, haven't been able to push their way into the first team. And then January, where they hit the buffers of PSR and FFP, like a lot of other teams in the Premier League have done. They're also in the process of losing their sporting director because Dan Ashworth is on gardening leave. So this idea that Newcastle were just kind of automatically going to get bigger and better has sort of taken a knock. Now the trajectory is only going to go in one way, because they still have the same ambitions. They've still got the same motivation. They do have resources to improve off the pitch. I think it's just that sense that, that it was going to be a clean process, that it was always going to be at that same sort of rate of knots. Hasn't quite worked out like that.
Yeah, Jacob, I'm thinking about positives from this season, and perhaps actually being out of all the cups to a certain degree, other than the Premier League, which is looking very unlikely, is probably a good thing for Newcastle, just to focus their energies on maybe finishing in a position which might take them to Europe next season.
Yeah, I mean, that's very out the silver linings playbook in that I'm sure that Newcastle would have absolutely loved another run to a cup final this season. As George said, it'll now be 70 years. But yes, they do still have an outside shot. Their injury crisis is starting to lessen a little bit, although this has sort of been choppy waves all season. And I mean, there are opportunities which can come in the rest of the season. For example, Louis Miley's appearances as a result of the injury crisis has been a massive boon for Newcastle. This is a player who hadn't even broken through the under-21s at the start of last season, now going to be playing above 30 games a year for Newcastle and showing how he is already a Premier League player. There could be similar stories to that coming through with people like Lewis Hall, Tino Livramento, different situations, of course, but ways in which they can entrench himself in the first team. If you take Europe as being an outside shot, it's those sorts of things which they can really take forward to the coming seasons long term, which Newcastle really need to hold on to.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of jump in there very briefly. I mean, I totally reject the idea that being out of the cups is positive, but I kind of know where that question's coming from, in the sense of only having one thing to focus on between now and May sort of be able to sort of, train thoughts in that one direction. They've only got one thing to look at, and that's getting into Europe. I don't think Europe is or should be an outside shot. I think they've got a good chance if they can rediscover some of their form. But the other side of that is we do have to remember that until the last, whatever it was, 20 minutes, half an hour, Newcastle had a shot of qualifying beyond the group stage of the Champions League. They competed in the Champions League. They finished bottom of their group, but they competed. And they also got to the quarterfinal of both domestic cup competitions. Now, that's not where they want to be, but at the same token, you take a step 2 years back. They got beyond the fourth round of the FA Cup once under Mike Ashley's ownership. The idea of getting to the quarterfinals of competitions, and again, the other thing to point out is they had ludicrous draws in all of these competitions. The Champions League, it was ridiculous, the draw that they came up with. It was brilliant, but it was ridiculous. They had to play both Manchester clubs in the League Cup. They then went out against Chelsea, which they shouldn't have done. They've been drawn away from home in the FA Cup. They then get Man City. There's been no respite, and there's been no chance. I mean, every single game has had that jeopardy to it, because there's not been a chance to take a breath in any of the draws they've had, either in terms of who they've played or where it's come in their season. So, now they do have a chance to take a breath and push to the end of the season. And I think it's really important actually for the club and for their development that they do get back into Europe to show to not only to the players they have, but also to the players that they want to sign that Europe is now their sort of natural domain.
I was watching Manchester United v Liverpool game with a very dispirited Newcastle United supporting friend, and he was talking about margins the moment after Diallo's winner went in, and he made a point that if not for an incredibly contentious handball decision in Paris, Newcastle could be preparing for a Champions League quarter-final in a week or two's time. I mean, Borussia Dortmund, who went through in second, beat PSV, who have obviously been in very good form in Netherlands, but their team from the Eredivisie. If that had happened, just the complexion of Newcastle's season is so much different. It's not like this has become a bad team overnight. It's a team who, in many areas, have been edged out this season.
Yeah, and I mean, again, it's important to point out that if this had been sort of any other season, or if last season hadn't happened and been quite as dramatic as it was, you'd be talking about this season as being one of the best in living memory because there've been so many incredible peaks. I mean, there's been a lot of sort of grueling stuff to go with it, of course, but you're talking about that PSG home game. I mean, that's arguably the best I've seen. St James's and heard. I was there for the Barcelona game all those years ago when Tino Asprilla, scored and that incredible force of nature night. But they have beaten both Manchester teams in the League Cup, including a historic victory at Old Trafford. They've beaten Sunderland, yes, who are in the Championship. It's the first time they've won a derby match for God knows how many years. They've beaten Sheffield United away 8-0. They hammered Aston Villa 5-1 on the first day of the season, really making you believe at that point that last season and this season there was going to be sort of no difference between the two things. And there's, more besides, beating Arsenal at home, beating Chelsea at home in the league, lots more. I mean, there's been sort of incredible highs. It's just been that underlying, the underlying situation has been A, injuries, and B, effectively you're talking about last season's team that's not had much help because of what's happened in the transfer windows. So it's been a really bizarre season. And if I can't, speaking personally, I sort of wanted last season to go on forever because it was that sort of magical feeling of going to games and being surprised when Newcastle won, happy and surprised when Newcastle won. This season, though, as soon as it starts, it's like, Newcastle are good. And so your own, I hate the word expectation, but your own thought process has changed. You're going to matches knowing that Newcastle are good. And I've been ready for this season to end since about November, probably the Bournemouth game that you mentioned earlier.
You talk about expectation, and the person, I guess, from the fans' perspective, central to that is Eddie Howe. Injuries, every Premier League club suffers with injuries. But in terms of how he's tactically managed to work with Newcastle this season, Jacob, how do we feel Eddie Howe has performed?
Yeah, like you say, he's been working with extremely limited resources in many of the games. It's kind of been, you could predict what 11 are going to go out on the pitch, and there's only so many different ways that he can set that up given that personnel. I just think that the rest of the season is going to be really interesting going forward because in his favour, there's two different ways I think which he could address this, which would really lead to optimism. One of these is a return to the identity of intensity, which Newcastle had last season, which for various reasons they have been missing. And the other one, if it's not a return to the intensity, is evolution of, there has been criticism that he's only set up his Newcastle team in one way, or they have a good plan A. I think to an extent that is fair. But he has made changes. So last match, he set up his team with a back five for the first time in 113 matches. There's ways in which Newcastle, when they do make entries into transfer window, can change their style of play to become more accomplished in possession rather than sort of relying more on transitions, for example, against top sides. And if either of those two start to flourish, then there are real shoots of optimism to take into next season where they will have the same targets as this year. This year hasn't changed that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been very difficult. It's been very difficult for their head coach, who, I mean, so as you say, every team has injuries. I think the problem is Newcastle have had a huge number of them, and B, it's totally affected the way they set up and the way they play. So, you go back to that the first game of the season, Aston Villa. Newcastle had players on the pitch, hungry and angry, wanting to keep their places, tearing into Villa for an hour, and then being replaced by angry, hungry players who were, annoyed that they hadn't started the season. And so there's been a physical sort of manifestation of injury in terms of players out, but there's also been that mental factor that players who have been played too much. They haven't had anybody to push them on. They haven't been able to have a break, and it's also become a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, I can remember thinking to myself when we finally saw Harvey Barnes, for the first time since the start of the season. Of course, he's now injured again. But we saw him kind of come on. It was like such a feeling of relief and happiness. And then within 2 matches, I'm thinking to myself, God, he's done nothing. What's he actually? And of course, but it's going to take him 2 months to get back to sort of full fitness. And it's become a self-fulfilling thing, that injury. And as Jacob says, I think the interesting thing is that, a manager has to find a way to win. And if you can't find a way to win, you have to find a way not to lose. And I think the question being asked of how has he done that enough? If you can't show intensity if there's nothing left in the tank. And so therefore, do you have to find a different way of setting up? And I think the thing that's been frustrating for Newcastle fans is to see their team making the same mistakes week in, week out. And that doesn't kind of reflect very well on the head coach. And I'm not sure that he has done that enough. Actually, having said all that, he is facing this situation. He is facing Europe for the first time in his career. He is facing this idea of not being on the training pitch in terms of being able to do any serious work for the first time ever. And he deserves a chance to go again after what he did in saving the team from relegation, and then the incredible achievement of last season. He does deserve another go at it. And yeah, to put some of that in context, you have to remember that, I mean, I think the game against City was interesting for the team against City was interesting for a couple of reasons. Firstly, 6 of those players in the starting 11 had been there from before the takeover. That's not an excuse. It's not a criticism, because those players, lifted and climbed with the other players brilliantly. And then of the other section of the team, I think only Anthony Gordon had arrived after the summer of 2022. So that's sort of 18 months of the team not being strengthened effectively. And so, of course, the team have gone backwards a bit. So he deserves, he absolutely deserves the faith from the fans, which he still has, and he deserves the faith of the ownership. Again, he deserves a chance to, if not put things right, then to have another go and refresh and start again.
Yeah, I wonder who else is in the coming out of the production line. You look at Manchester United, you look at Liverpool, it's Liverpool in particular most recently, having to rely on young players. Lewis Miley, of course, has shone brilliantly for Newcastle this season. But, Lewis Hall, think about the young lad they brought in from Chelsea. Now, I think Dan Burn was playing in that position a few times. No disrespect to Dan Burn, probably not the most mobile as a fullback. Do they have reinforcements back there, George?
You mean in the academy?
Yeah, from the youth system. And
no, academy. I mean, I don't. I mean, this is something that, I mean, a lot of investment has gone into the academy, and in terms of changeover of staff under their academy manager Steve Harper, that's happening. But these things take a long time. They're probably 10 years, if not more, behind teams like Chelsea and Manchester City, and you can't just magic players off the production line. They're very, very proud of Lewis Miley and what they've and his achievement so far. And Elliot Anderson is there and part of the team when he's fit too. But no, they're really just at the start of something in that. And they've also invested in young players, bringing in young players into the club. But again, that's not something that's been done for a long, long time. And so, um, so that's not something that you can just click your fingers and expect things to change. There's always been good people at Newcastle in terms of staff. And one of the things that Dan Ashworth has been doing is repopulating departments that were actually absolutely sort of stripped back to the bone and all in survival mode, as opposed to trying to thrive. But we're not going to see the fruits of that for a little while yet.
It was fascinating to watch the League Cup final and see Liverpool have a player such as Bobby Clark come on, who's was a member of the Newcastle Academy. They had another player as well in Connell, who's from North East, and it just shows that for so long Newcastle weren't seen as the destination. Sunderland and Middlesbrough were in the local area for these sorts of players, and that is now starting to change. It's no longer seen that Elliot Anderson came through despite the system rather than because of the system. And yes, it's right at the beginning of that journey, but there are good signs. So this week, Trevin Sanusi and Leo Shahar were both called up for England under 17. They're both seen as two massive prospects. I think Miley's playing for the under 21s, and that's something which Newcastle haven't had in a good while. And there may be some more of them seen at the end of the season or even on this postseason tour, which has been announced this week.
I mean, and that's a very good point. I mean, the other thing, and something that, again, this is, it'll be interesting to see what happens in a post Ashworth kind of landscape. But when the new owners came in, they saw a club in which there were, as I say, good people stripped back to the bone, but nobody was talking to each other. So everybody was siloed. That's the phrase that everyone uses. And people were trying to survive until the end of the day, without making a mistake. And those departments have been built up, or that process of building them up has started. They're all talking together. They're communicating. There is this idea of a common cause and a common theme. And why is that sort of stuff important? Well, it's important because if your head coach is Eddie Howe, and if he has decided that to use an example, intensity is your identity, it's important that identity stretches into the academy so that when players do step up, they're not surprised by what's being asked of them. And the same thing, absolutely, for the scouting departments, whether they're looking at data, whether they're seeing players in the flesh, that everybody, it's like, okay, well, if in whatever, 3 years time, when someone's out of contract, we need a new left back or centre midfielder, that they have the qualities that match their head coach, that match the club. And it seems, those seems like very, very basic things, but they just haven't existed at Newcastle well, I don't think they've ever existed at Newcastle. So those things are kind of important, and it's positive that it's happening. Again, the question mark is, without Ashworth, what kind of sporting director do they go for? And is that identity strong enough? Is that identity what Newcastle want to be long term? And who is going to take those long-term decisions about, what's best for the club? So, I mean, again, I think it's a sort of interesting moment. When I say you can't necessarily guarantee that things will be better or stronger in 12 months' time, that's the reason. The other side of it is they have a big summer ahead of them in terms of the window. What do? Do they stick or twist? They haven't got a lot of money to spend unless they bring money in. So what does that mean? And then there's no guarantee that the people they bring in are better than the people that they sell. So it's a fascinating moment.
Yeah, what's best for the club? That really sticks in my mind at this point, because I want to ask you, Jacob, about this friendly Newcastle are going to be playing against Spurs, a postseason friendly in Australia 3 days after the season ends. What's that all about?
It's pretty open what it's about. Speaking to sources at the club, they're very open about the fact this is a commercial decision. It's not a sporting decision. No one wants to go and send 30 players the entire way across the world 3 days after the season. But both teams, especially Newcastle and Tottenham, who are sort of trying to make the step into being perennial Champions League competitors, need to grow their revenue in order to compete with PSR. That's the simple reality of it. In some ways, this isn't a Newcastle and Tottenham problem. In some ways, this is a general player calendar problem and an FFP problem, where it kind of leads to this situation where yes, the health of clubs is being protected to an extent by PSR and FFP, but is the health of players? Do there need to be rules introduced, such as a cap on appearances per year, which Vincent Company suggested, or, for example, a ring fence break, which FIFA are pursuing? Those are all factors which I think are almost more a solution to this issue. At the same time, though, what's going to be really interesting is that this isn't an international window. 3 weeks later, both the Euros and the Copa America start. Both clubs anticipate their big stars appearing in it. I mean, I don't know if you saw what happened with Lionel Messi last month when he didn't appear in a friendly in Hong Kong, and it caused a diplomatic storm. What's going to happen if, for example, James Maddison or Kieran Trippier or Anthony Gordon, if they're lucky enough to be named in England's Euro squad, don't appear? It's going to have another commercial hit. The FA may well want to get in contact with Newcastle and Tottenham and stake their own claim for that not to happen. So it's going to rumble on. It's a bit of a contentious one, but it's a weird landscape in which this does make strange, macabre sense.
I mean, Newcastle need money, and the fact that they're doing this is an absolute illustration of it. I've just made a kind of case for why Howe and the team and the club deserve sympathy or empathy. I mean, nobody else is going to care about it apart from Newcastle fans. I understand that, but for this is the first time they've experienced this number of games. They've had a horrific injury list. They're not showing themselves much respect by doing this straight at the end of the season when everybody is going to be. I mean, everyone needs a rest now. Everyone needs a break now, effectively. It's, in footballing terms, there's no justification for it whatsoever. In environmental terms, there's not much justification for it, but they have to bring money in, and as Jacob says, they have to get their name known, and they have to become more recognizable. I mean, it seems ludicrous on the face of it, though.
Yeah, and
Bruno
talk about
is probably
okay.
the one player whose fitness Newcastle have been fortunate with this season. If he plays the rest of the Premier League games, if he plays in these two matches, it will be his 62nd game of the season, and then he has to go play for Brazil at Copa America, which is a dream of his. It's utterly crazy, I think, when you look at it in those terms. But
Yeah.
Yeah, you just mentioned Bruno Guimarães, and I do think, from PSL terms, George, um, might Newcastle still have to sell perhaps one or two of their big stars this summer? You talk about money coming into the club. I mean, this is profit.
So, I mean, in terms of what they were trying to do in January, I mean, they were absolutely at their limit of PSR. It was the moment that Howe needed help more than any other, and they couldn't do anything. And they did have a look at selling to buy. That was the only thing that they could have done. And they've it's a fact to say that one part of the club that hasn't got better since the takeover is knowing when to sell. And part of that is because they haven't got many assets. I mean, and the people, the assets that they do have are incredibly valuable to them in football terms. So that when I described it as a big summer, that's what I mean. They've got big decisions to make. Now, they don't have to sell Bruno. The question that he'll have to ask himself is whether he's now a Champions League player in his own mind and feels the need to move elsewhere to kind of carry that on. Also, it's also depending on offers, whether offers come in for him. They have other saleable assets in people like Alexander Isak and Sven Botman, who I'm sure would be wanted by other teams. If they don't go down that route, there's also someone like Joelinton, who's at the moment is got 1 year left on his contract, albeit they're talking. The other route you go down is shaving off players who are perhaps coming towards the end of their career, whether it's someone like Callum Wilson, who's had loads of injuries, or Almiron, who they looked at selling in January. Does that create enough money? And of course, the other thing is homegrown players, because that's then pure profit. I mean, it is this. I'm not trying to, again, this isn't something new, but it is kind of a very strange position for Newcastle and clubs like Newcastle to be in, where they do actually have money but can't spend it, and selling the players that they've produced themselves is the clearest and most obvious way to kind of get pure profit. But yeah, all those things are being discussed. at some point, if you retreat back 2 years to when the takeover happened, or to when they signed Bruno Guimarães in the first place, they always knew that at some point they would sell. At some point, that was always the case with the FFP, that you buy at the right time, you nurture players, and you then sell for profit and then reinvest that profit. The last two windows, however, have shown that reinvesting sometimes is impossible, but also, you're not going to be, you can't, no club can be infallible in the transfer market. I mean, Newcastle had an astonishing hit rate until last summer. And I think last summer, there was a bit of misfortune in terms of Tonali. There's misfortune certainly in terms of Harvey Barnes and injuries. But I think they tried to be too clever with Livramento and Lewis Hall. The idea there was that the biggest drop off in the squad in terms of quality was in the fullback positions, and they'd protected those positions for years to come. But of course, they've ended up effectively not strengthening their first team pool at all.
Let's end it there. George, Jacob, thank you so much for your time. And don't forget to rate and review the podcast. We'll be back tomorrow for more. Thanks for listening.